Hello everyone. Hello Photopills. Welcome to another masterclass. Today we have the great Chris Nicholson with us. Thank you, great Chris, to be with us today. And today we're going to learn how to photograph lighthouses at night with the Milky Way, star trails, at night basically. Isn't it, Chris? Thank you again.
Thanks for having me. Been looking forward to this for a long time. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. I mean, I really enjoyed your presentation that you did during the Photopills camp.
Thank you.
It was amazing about photographing lighthouses because in Menorca we have 7 lighthouses to photograph, and we learned a lot. Thanks a lot for accepting the invitation to join us today, because I'm sure a lot of people in our community has the same issues: how to shoot properly a lighthouse at night.
There are some issues, that's for sure. It seems straightforward.
It seems easy, but it is not.
It's not, no. And we're going to cover, especially at night, there are issues, and we're going to cover those.
Awesome. So for the people that doesn't know you, who is Chris Nicholson?
Who is Chris Nicholson? Let me switch to the presentation. I got a couple slides that'll help with that. But I'm in the States, and here we go. You can see my talk now.
Yes.
So I'm in the States. I grew up here. I was actually born in Greece, but not a Greek citizen. My dad was in the Navy. But I grew up in the States, and I've been shooting for about 30 years since college. My dad was in the photography, and uncle was a professional photographer, and a friend of the family was a professional photographer. So I grew up around it. And combine that with my love of the outdoors and the national parks, this was just natural for me. So these days, most of my work is through national parks at night. I'm one of the partners and instructors. We do night photography workshops all over the world, mostly in the States, but we're international too. Also work on 2 conferences, the Nightscaper Photo Conference, which is held in Kanab, Utah in May, and also the Night Photo Summit, which Raphael, you've been a great speaker at both years that's run. That happens in February. That's an online conference. Also, I mentioned my love of the parks, and I get into the parks to shoot as much as I can, which led me to writing this book a few years ago. This came out in 2015, Photographing National Parks, and has opened a lot of doors for me. And this was just a big passion project for me. And I'm still out in the park shooting a lot. But then, as you mentioned, I also love shooting lighthouses. And there's a lot of lighthouses in national parks, but of course, there's a lot more around the world outside of the parks as well. I loved speaking about them at the Photopills camp, and that led to me actually writing a book that I am announcing today. Nobody knows about this yet, except Raphael. I told you right before we started. So this is the first public acknowledgement that Photographing Lighthouses is my new book, which is coming out next May. So I'm really excited about this. Actually just saw the cover yesterday and really excited about how it came out. So it's not for sale yet, but if you go to the website, photographinglighthouses.com, you can put your name and email address in there, and we will email you as soon as it is going on sale for pre-orders, and when it hits, it'll be on Amazon and hopefully lots of other places too. So very excited about this. So that's me.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Nice. Can't wait to read it. Supposedly we'll learn quite a few things on that will be explained very well in the book too. So what exactly we will be learning today?
So we're going to talk about primarily shooting lighthouses at night. Now, there's challenges to shooting lighthouses in general. Perspective is one of the big ones, perspective distortion. But then at night, you get all sorts of problems with exposure. It's just, you're talking about shooting in the dark, and then you've got like the brightest thing in the world in your frame. So how do you compensate to be able to create photos where that lantern is just not completely overwhelming your composition?
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to get started. So if you want, I'm ready.
Okay, so here we go. So photographing lighthouses at night. Before we actually get into the meat of this, I want to talk about a few terms so that as we're going through the presentation, you'll know what I'm talking about if you don't already. Now, the tower is the actual structure of the lighthouse. A lot of times there might be a house at the bottom, as you can see here. There might be a house off to the side. Those things are great for doing more complex compositions, juxtaposing different things in the frame. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But the tower is the big structure that is holding that light high above the ground. Now, the lantern room is what's up on top. That is the whole structure at the top with the glass that the light is emanating from. And inside the lantern room is the lamp itself. So that's that lens, whether it's an old Fresnel lens or a lot of lighthouses now have LEDs. So the lamp is what's actually creating the light inside the lantern room at the top of the tower. Another term that we'll talk about a little bit is characteristics. The characteristics of a lighthouse are all the different things that make a particular lighthouse unique. So it could be how bright the light is and what color the light is. What does the lighthouse look like? What kind of tower is it? How is it painted? What is the range of the light? Every lighthouse in the world is unique, and the characteristics of it, that set of that whole set of pieces, everything that makes that lighthouse unique, that's what's called the characteristics. And one of the very important characteristics of a lighthouse is the signature. And the signature is the flash pattern. And we're going to cover that in a little bit because it's very important to solving one of the biggest problems that we come across when photographing lighthouses at night. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about two big challenges. So lighthouses might seem pretty straightforward to shoot. It's a building in the landscape. Set up your camera, take a picture. Sure, you can do that. And a lot of the things that you might normally do with photography, with landscape photography, do play into that, right? Looking for sunrises and sunset and looking for nice light and finding the Milky Way and all the things with landscape photography that you do, they do apply to lighthouses. But the lighthouse itself is going to present two big challenges. And one of those is exposure. It is very difficult in a lot of circumstances to control that lamp from blowing out in a night exposure. And the other big challenge that a lighthouse presents is the perspective distortion, where you see you've got this big, tall structure, and if you're not careful about how you shoot it, it ends up being distorted, bending in, bending back, bending forward. However you're set up, there are things that are going to make that lighthouse look kind of strange. And we're going to talk about that too. We'll define both of those problems better as we go along, and then also give you multiple tips for how to deal with those. We'll talk about exposure first. And the first point I want to make, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about with exposure is centered around that lantern, around that lamp, and keeping it from blowing out or blowing out too much. And that second point that I just made, blowing out too much, that's important because having that light blow out isn't a problem. In fact, I would argue that you should let it blow out a little bit, if not completely, because a light source at night to our naked eye always looks blown out. So if you try too hard to control detail in there, that presents problems too. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. So here's two different photos of the same lighthouses. This is the Pemaquid Point Lighthouse in Maine in the States. And the one on the left, I did an exposure where I maintained a lot of detail up in that lantern room. And on the right, the exposure, that lamp is blowing out, right? And I'm going to talk about how to control this a little later. The one on the left, it looks fine. I don't think there's a problem with either one of these necessarily. But there is a difference, and I think there's a sweet spot that we're looking for. The one on the left has nice detail up there, but that's not necessarily what a lighthouse looks like to our naked eye. A lot of times at night, when we're doing night photography in urban scenes, you've got street lights or lamps or building windows. If you try to save too much detail in them, keep them from blowing out at all, they tend to look fake, because that's not what it looks like to our naked eye. The image on the right, I think, is blowing out too much. There's no detail at all in there, and it's just this big white blob in the middle of the frame. So for me, I would look for something in between this, where it's blowing out a little bit. We don't have a fake amount of detail, an amount of detail in there that looks fake, but we're not completely losing everything and don't have this giant blob in the middle of the frame. Now, there's no right or wrong on this, and there are different things that can affect how far you might want to go in either direction. And part of that is, what is the focus of your composition? So think about a big bright light in a dark scene attracts a lot of attention, right? So if we think compositionally, our eye goes to those bright scenes, those high contrast spots in a composition. So if your composition is about the lantern, then maybe that's okay. But here's a photo where the composition is more about the boat and the house than it is the lamp. So in this case, I did an exposure where I really controlled the details up in the lantern, because I didn't want that blowing out. I didn't want that distracting from the rest of the scene. But here's a photo where the story is more about this big bright light in a star-filled sky, right? That is the focus of the composition. So here, it didn't bother me so much that the light was blowing out. Again, I'm choosing when to let the light blow out based on my composition. Another thing you can think about is how big that lamp is in the scene. So if your lighthouse is very small in the composition, then you could probably get away with it blowing out more than if the lantern is very large in the composition. So the photo on the right, the lighthouse it's pretty small, right? So having that light blowing out doesn't distract too much. In fact, it helps pull some attention to an element of the scene that's important, but that's not overwhelming. Now, the photo on the right, this is too distracting, in my opinion, because the lamp is so big in the scene and it's blowing out, and that becomes just all the viewer looks at. So for that photo, I would want to pull in the details a little bit. Again, not completely. So this photo, I've got some detail. I can see the bars in the lantern room, but I don't see every little cobweb up there either. So this to me is a more realistic view, a more pleasing view of what this particular lighthouse in this particular composition should look like. Here's another example. Raphael, you know this lighthouse, right?
I know this place, yes.
Yes, you know this place pretty well. This is in Menorca. I'm sorry if I butcher the name. I'm going to give it a shot, though. I'm going to try my Spanish. I haven't used my Spanish since I was in Barcelona, but the Favarich Lighthouse. Okay, Lighthouse. Yeah. So we shot this during the Photopills camp, and it's such a beautiful location. And for this photo, got it pulled back, and I loved the road winding up to the lighthouse. And in this case, that lighthouse is so small in the composition. If I had tried to retain detail in there and didn't let the lantern blow out, I don't even know if we would have seen the lighthouse in the composition. So here it's blowing out a lot, but it's helping to draw attention to this tiny little subject that's in the center of the frame. Mm-hmm. Incidentally, how did I know that the Milky Way was going to be over the lighthouse that night? Photopills, right? So in this presentation, I'm also going to throw in some examples of how I used Photopills to make these photos. And in this case, this was a no-brainer. And when we got there and the lighthouse is, we've got this great sort of southern view. And so we knew we'd be able to shoot the Milky Way over the lighthouse that night. So really good example of how you could use Photopills for scouting lighthouse photos. And I've got some more examples of that coming up. Mm-hmm. All right, so when we talk about not letting the light blow out too much, a lot of people ask, well, how about blending? Can't I just do a couple of exposures and blend them together? And sure, you can. So you could take a photo with the lamp blowing out and take another photo of it not blowing out and put them together, and you get something like this. If this is what you want to do, by all means, but what I would caution is that it's very easy to make it look fake. This is not a successful blend, in my opinion. It's too much detail. Again, this is not what the lighthouse would look like if we were there in person. This is not what it looks like to our eye. So if you're going to do a blend, then again, go for something with middle ground. Don't do a blend where you get all that detail in there. Let it blow out a little bit so it's a little bit more of a realistic effect. Now, I don't want to get too much into post-processing today, but I did want to just show quickly exactly what I'm talking about with the blend. So again, the idea is you take a photo where you can get the foreground and the lighthouse exposed nicely, and then you do a photo where the lantern room is exposed nicely, and you blend them to create something like what's on the right, which is essentially a night HDR. That's exactly what it is. And the way that I would do that in most circumstances is just to pull both of those photos into Photoshop as layers. So they're each their own layer, and then you create a mask on the layer that has the detail in the lantern. And then you kind of just pull back the opacity a little bit until you get something that looks nice. Lots of tutorials online about how to do this if you want to get into this technique. So here's another example of, again, just letting it blow out, but maintaining a little bit of detail, but not too much. Okay, I mentioned signature before as one of the terms that I want you to know with lighthouses. And I want to talk about signature now and how it affects exposure. So what is a signature? The signature of a lighthouse is what makes it unique. And it will be the color of the light. Is that light on all the time, or is it flashing? If it's flashing, how long does it flash for? And how long is it off? And that's called the eclipse. All of these things make up the signature. And the reason for this is because this is not what a lighthouse looks like to a ship captain. Now, it might surprise everybody in this presentation, but lighthouses were not built for photographers, right? They were built for people in boats and ships, ship captains who are out at sea as navigational aids and warning of hazardous areas near the shore. This is not what a lighthouse looks like to a ship captain. It's a little more like that, right? In fact, it's really a little more like that because ship captains are far out at sea. And at night, it doesn't even look like that because they can't see it, right? So at night, that's what it looks like. Now, how do you tell the difference between that lighthouse and another one? So if you're a ship captain, you're looking for the signature of the lighthouse. So this one right here is just flashing in a repeating pattern. But there might be another lighthouse on the shore that is flashing at a different pattern. And another lighthouse that's not flashing at all. And there might be another lighthouse that's flashing red and white with different colors. So when you're a ship captain far out at sea and you don't even see the land, you're only seeing the lights, you can look at your charts, or you can Google these days, and you can see what lighthouse is what just by seeing what its signature is. So how long is the flash on? How long is the flash off? Is it flashing at all? Is it flashing different colors? All right, that's how a ship captain uses this. Why does a photographer care? Why does a photographer care about the signature of a lighthouse? And it's because it affects exposure. So everything I've talked about so far in terms of not letting the lantern blow out, you use the signature of the lighthouse to figure out how to expose it so you can control whether it blows out or not and how much light you're getting in that lantern. So for example, if we were to do, I just want to show you these photos as an example of this concept. Say we had a 10-second exposure that looked good, right? If the lighthouse did not come on for that entire 10 seconds, then you would not see anything up in the lantern room, right? That makes sense. Now, say during that same 10-second exposure, the lamp lit once, then it might look like that. Say in that same 10-second exposure, the lamp lights twice, then it might look like that. So every time that the light lights up, it's creating more and more light in your exposure, and you're getting closer and closer to it perhaps blowing out in your frame. That's an important concept to remember. Okay, now that said, we want to talk about the 4 different kinds of lighthouses, and then we're going to talk about how the signature affects how you might shoot those. The 4 kinds of lighthouses are: one, you've got a flashing lighthouse, and this is a lighthouse that has a light that just goes on and off. So again, it's going to be in a pattern. It might be different colors, but it's just going on and off. There's also a revolving lighthouse. This is when the beam is turning around up in the lantern room. So when you're out at sea, at a particular point, it looks like it's just turning on and off, but the functionality of it is that it's spinning around. There's also a fixed beam lighthouse. This is a lighthouse that's just on. It doesn't flash. It doesn't change colors. It's just always on. And then there's also what's referred to as a dark lighthouse, which is a lighthouse that's not in use anymore and doesn't have any light in it. So if you're going to shoot a flashing beam lighthouse, it's one of the easiest to shoot because you can time your exposure with the dark periods, the eclipse of the signature. And you can adjust your exposure by blocking the lens when the lamp is lit. Now, let me show you an example. This is the Body Island Lighthouse in North Carolina in the United States. And this has a signature of 2.5 seconds on, 2.5 seconds off, 2.5 seconds on, and then 22.5 seconds off. So that's a pretty long gap. And if you know night photography, that 22.5 seconds is an important number to you, because with most lenses that you're using at night, you can't really shoot for longer than about 20 seconds before your stars start to move, right? So if you want good star point exposures, you're probably shooting at 10, 12, 15, 20 seconds, and very rarely getting longer than that unless you've got a super, super wide lens. So this is actually a pretty easy lighthouse to shoot star points with because of that 22.5 second gap in there where the light is off. All I have to do is just wait for it to be on for 2.5 seconds, and then off for 2.5 seconds, and then it comes on for 2.5 seconds again, and right as it's starting to fade, I'll open the shutter. So here it's on, right? Now it's off. I gotta wait for it to come on again, and I'm counting the whole time, and I shoot now. And so now it got that little bit of light at the top, and now it's got 22.5 seconds to burn the stars in. So that's how I control the exposure when shooting a lighthouse like this to end up with a photo that looks like that. Now, the Body Island Lighthouse is pretty easy because it's got that 22.5 seconds, right? I can get a good star point exposure in 22.5 seconds. So it's really easy to just wait for those first 2 flashes, open the shutter right at the end of that second flash, get a little bit of light in there so it's not blowing out, and then the stars burn in during the dark period. Here's a lighthouse in Maine. This is the West Quoddy Head Lighthouse. This has a different signature. Again, every lighthouse is going to have its own signature. The West Quoddy headlight is on for 2 seconds, off for 2 seconds, on for 2 seconds, and then off for 9. So 9 seconds of darkness, that's not enough time to burn in a good star point exposure, right? Unless you've got a crazy high ISO, but there really aren't any cameras that can shoot quality image at a high ISO, at an ISO high enough to do star points in, say, 8 seconds. So with most cameras, we need more time to burn in those stars. So how am I going to get that when this light is flashing on and off? All right, so here it comes on again, and now it's off for 9 seconds, but 9 seconds isn't enough. I need more time to burn those stars in. If I were to keep shooting, again, as I showed before, when that light flashes that second time, when it flashes the third time, when it flashes the fourth time during the same exposure, all that light is accumulating and it's going to blow out. So this is what I want to do with a lighthouse like this. I go ahead and I leave the shutter open during that dark period and I'm counting, right? So here we go, 9 seconds, 8, 7, 6, 5. I'm going to count it down. And as soon as the light's ready to come back on again, I'm going to block the lens. It's as simple as that. So if you've got your lens set up on the tripod, when that light comes on again, just put your hand in front of it. Or if you've got a black hat, you can put that in front of it. If you're really fancy and you have a black card, you can put a black card in front of it. If you use your hand, I would recommend putting a black glove on because any light that shines off your hand could ruin your exposure. So keep things nice and dark. I really like using this wool cap because this really covers the lens nicely. So again, I'm leaving the shutter open and I'm going to do some test exposures and I'm going to find, so like for example, right now, I might do a test exposure and find that 4 flashes is way too bright and even 2 flashes is too bright, but 1 flash is perfect. So I'm going to cover up the lens. I'm going to let the camera, I'm going to let the photo record 1 flash, but then every time that lighthouse is going to flash again, I just cover the lens. And that's how I keep that exposure from blowing out.
Super cool. Very interesting.
Good, yeah. And it takes some practice, but it's not that hard once you know how to do it. And you can get creative with it too, which I'm going to show that in a minute. So here's a photo where I was using that technique. This is the Highland Lighthouse in Massachusetts in the United States. And the signature of this lighthouse is that it's on for 1 second and then it's off for 6 seconds. So if you're doing a 20-second exposure to get those stars, you've got to actually block the lens 2 or 3 times to get that exposure right. Here's one where I didn't block it enough. With 1 second and 6 seconds, the timing's becoming harder because it's more frequent, right? And here's one where my timing was too good and I didn't get anything up in the lantern room at all. So when you're in the field, just practice this. It might take you a few times to get it right, but it's really not that hard. And once you get the timing down, that actually becomes a lot of fun to do. Okay, so a revolving beam lighthouse. Again, this is a lighthouse where it's not flashing, but the light is on continuously and it's spinning around. These are a little harder to expose, and I'm going to show why in a minute. It's because it's never really dark. And even when that light's not facing you, it's facing somewhere. So there's light in the sky, there's light on the things in the scene. If there's any atmosphere at all, that's going to pick up the light, which is actually a good thing. And I'll show why in a little bit. And it's all about timing. So just like we were using timing with a flashing light, there's also timing tricks with the revolving beam. And we also can do some nice effects with a revolving beam that we couldn't do with a flashing light. Okay, so here's the same lighthouse in Menorca, right? So this is a great example of a revolving beam. If I remember correctly, it takes, I think, 30 seconds for it to go all the way around. Is that right, Raphael? Or was it?
I don't remember, but
okay. Well, I mean, we could look at it right now and we could count it. Now if I remember right, there's three lights. I think it might be 7.5 seconds, 7.5 seconds, and 15 seconds. But here you can see that it's revolving. And watch what's going on in the light when it's revolving. Just in the lamp itself, that lantern room, the brightness of the lantern room is changing from our perspective. As a photographer, that's important because when I shoot is going to change how bright the light is up in the lantern. So I'm going to have to adjust my exposure based on where the light is pointing. And I'll show some more about that in a little bit. So there's that photo, right? So we can see the light is spreading out nicely, even in all directions. Here's another one. This is in the States. This is the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, probably the most famous lighthouse for photographers in the States. And as that beam goes round, it's in different spots, right? So that changes what we might want to do in the composition, because each photo looks different depending on where the beam is going. And also the exposure in the lamp is different for each one. So here's a photo where the light's just going out from side to side. And here's one where it's coming straight at us. And you can see the difference. There's about a 1 to maybe even 2-stop exposure up in the lantern room between those two shots. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're shooting a revolving beam. Now, another thing that we can do, and I'm going to cover more about this later, but I want to show it now, is we can use that to create a really cool effect where we just call this a beam photo, where you can take all those different photos while the beam's revolving and put them together to create this kind of an effect. You can do this in post-processing, and you can also do it in camera. And I'm going to show you both in a little while. Fixed beam lighthouse. This is a whole different monster, because this light does not move. It is on and it blows out. It's easiest to shoot a fixed beam light at twilight because all of the tricks I've talked about so far, all these tricks to control the exposure of that lamp, aren't going to work at night. Here's an example of a fixed beam lighthouse. Now here the exposure was pretty easy because I'm in an urban environment. There was lots of light around. This is not a completely dark scene. Same lighthouse. Look at all that light coming from the bridge next to it. All right. So here I didn't have much of a problem with the fixed beam because it's blending nicely with the rest of the scene. This is a twilight shot. This is another time when it's very easy to balance. So this is a trick of architectural photographers use this, for getting what looks like a night shot, where you can get that twilight sky and the interior lights all in the same exposure. This is kind of like this magic 15 minutes of twilight when you can get all this into the same dynamic range of an image. Same thing here. This is at twilight. And then also moonlight. This is another fixed beam lighthouse. There's something else lighting the scene. It's not completely dark. This moonlight is another excellent time to photograph a fixed beam, again, because you've got something helping you out. It's not this one continuous bright light in a completely dark environment.
Chris, is there any particular moon phase that you like to photograph with lighthouses?
Anytime there's moon, depending on your exposure and how much moon you have, you can, create different effects. This I shot under a gibbous moon, so it was almost full, but I love shooting under a crescent moon too. You're going to be balancing different amounts of light, and you just have to deal with that. But for this really bright lighthouse, this is up right on the Canada-US border in Canada. And it was a small lighthouse, but really bright. So I'm glad that I had that almost full moon to fill in the rest of the scene.
Cool, thank you.
Another thing you can do with a fixed beam lighthouse is an HDR. Now, I don't do a lot of HDR. I use HDR when it's necessary, when it's just impossible to get all the light in a scene into one exposure. And I might use HDR to try to recreate what the scene looked like to my eye, right? Because our eyes are a lot more sensitive and adaptable than a camera sensor. And you can use HDR to recreate that effect. So if you've got a fixed beam lighthouse and it's already dark out, then that's an opportunity for maybe doing an HDR, which is exactly what I did here, right? To get any detail, to keep anything from blowing out, including the tower itself, because it had a floodlight on it. I couldn't get anything else in the scene, nothing in the foreground, nothing in the sky. But by doing another exposure to get the foreground lit and another exposure to get some stars and then doing an HDR, I was able to create an image. So think of HDR as another solution for a fixed beam lighthouse. One thing that you can do in the field, if you're in a situation where you've got a fixed beam and it's already dark, a couple of things to look for. This is the Marshall Point Lighthouse in Maine, and there was a little bit of atmosphere. And because this lighthouse has bars in the lantern room, the fixed beam created that beam effect for me. It's the shadow of the bars that's creating the beam effect here, as opposed to the revolving lighthouse where we're going to use post-processing or a special in-field technique to create the beam effect. Here it's the bars on the windows that are creating it. So this is something to look for with the fixed beam lighthouse. There usually are bars in the lantern room, and if you've got a little bit of atmosphere, then you can get this effect. Works with a lot of atmosphere too. If it's foggy, the lighthouse is a great place to be.
Mm-hmm. Chris,
Yes.
we have a question relative to the fixed beam Canada border lighthouse from Bengal Lake. What's the aperture you used for the?
This was a relatively small aperture. You can see the starburst effect in the lighthouse. This was, if I remember correctly, it was f8. It might be f11, but I'm pretty sure it's f8. And I did that on purpose to get that starburst effect. If I had shot at 2.8, so many times we're shooting wide open at night. But you don't have to do that in moonlight because there is a lot of light coming from the moon. So I used that, stopped down, and I let the moon fill in and got that nice starburst effect from the smaller aperture.
Cool, thank you.
Sure. Okay. So another technique that you can use with the fixed beam to try to control that is to change your angle. So here's just a diagram of if my camera is back to where I can see the top of that lighthouse, that I can see the whole lantern room, then I'm going to be seeing all of that light too, although that light is hitting the camera. Whereas if you were to move up and get underneath the lighthouse and get out of the direct path of the beam, then you can use that as a trick to control that lamp blowing out. And here's an example. So here I just moved up underneath, and that lantern is still blowing out, but it's not blowing out as badly as in the image before, right? And that's just because I'm changing the angle. That light's not coming directly at me anymore. And you can get even more extreme. Here's one where I moved so far up that I can't see the lantern at all. So if you're shooting a fixed beam, again, good trick is to get underneath at a dramatic angle that allows you to hide the light source. Okay, a dark lighthouse.
Chris, but putting your finger on the lighthouse would work on the lamp?
Putting your finger on the lighthouse. You're going to get a dark spot in the sky too. You can try it. So the technique, this is used a lot when shooting the sun or the moon directly in the frame and kind of trying to hide it for a little bit of the exposure to control flare or to control exposure. You're basically dodging in camera, right? So it's that old darkroom dodging technique, which you're doing it in camera. It's really hard to do. If that's a technique that you're accustomed to and you want to try doing it with a lighthouse, then by all means, and if you get it to work, please email me. I'd love to see it. But for me, there's other techniques that I use to do it. All right, so a dark lighthouse. There are plenty of lighthouses around the world that are not being used anymore. A lot of them have been sold to private individuals or to community groups that keep the lighthouse going. But a lot of times those lighthouses are just turned off. Now they're still there and you can still photograph them. But how do you deal with the light not being there? Well, for one, the exposure is pretty easy now, right? Because you don't have that big light. But I would look into the possibility of adding light. So this is the Roanoke Marshes Lighthouse in Virginia, in the States. Funny thing about this lighthouse is when I shot it, it was dark when I shot this photo, and it's actually not dark anymore. I brought a group here just last summer, and they have restored the light. So I had gotten the group all ready to shoot a dark lighthouse, and we had a strategy and everything, and then the light came on. So that was kind of funny. Whole different experience now. But at the time I shot this, it was dark. And I didn't worry about it. For this particular photo, I just light painted the lighthouse itself, and I wasn't worried about not having a beam up top. This is a lighthouse in Florida in Biscayne National Park that is not lit, but in this photo, it looks lit. And that's because we added light. So this was on a workshop, and we were able to get permission to go into the lighthouse, and the ranger unlocked it for us and allowed us to go in. And so we took a Luxley Viola panel light and put it up in the top. And then we took tea lights and we put them in the windows. So we made it look like this dark lighthouse was still active. Now, of course, you can't always do this, right? I mean, we got special access because we were there on a permit and all that, but it's always worth asking. You never know. And you can find some dark lighthouses that you can get into as well. Something else you can try, and I don't have an example of it here, but if you can get behind the lighthouse and shine a very bright, tight beam of a flashlight into the back, that's another way that you might be able to light up a lantern room on your own without getting inside. All right, let's talk about the beam photo that I showed before, because this is a pretty cool trick. We're doing this with again, with a lighthouse that has a revolving beam. As that light is moving through the atmosphere, and that's important. We need a little bit of atmosphere for this to work. If it's perfectly clear and very dry out, you don't get much of a beam effect. But with just a little bit of humidity or a little bit of dust in the air, or if it's misty or a little bit foggy, maybe just a very light drizzle, then that atmosphere will pick up the light and allow you to create this kind of effect. So what you want to do is just shoot a series of exposures. Set up your tripod, and you're going to need a relatively quick exposure. So you're either going to need a very high ISO, or in this case, I was shooting with some moonlight. But this is probably a 1 second exposure. And I just connect a remote shutter release and hold it down while the beam makes one full revolution. And that gives me all the raw materials that I need to create this in post-processing. You don't have to worry about a gap between the photos. You don't have to, shoot one and stop and shoot one and stop and shoot one and stop. Just, hold down the button and let them go. The time that it takes for the camera to close the shutter and reopen it is enough so that it will create a gap between the beams in each frame. They're not going to be right next to each other, so you don't have to worry about that. Just hold it down and let it go. And now we're going to use those photos to create this in post-processing, right? So this is relatively easy. If you know how to create star trails from multiple exposures by stacking them, it's the same exact technique. The post-production. So again, I'm going to show two ways to do this in post-production and in camera. So again, we're watching the beam go around, right? And we're shooting. So it's click, 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 and that's how we get all the raw materials. Once we get them in the Lightroom, we select all of those photos, and you want to go to the photo menu, and then edit in and open as layers in Photoshop. And what that's going to do is it's going to take every photo that you've selected, and it's going to pull it into Photoshop in one file with every photo as its own layer. And it'll look like this. So you can see there, every photo has been loaded, each has its own layer. And then we select all of those layers. It's as easy as just clicking on the top one, holding down the Shift key, and clicking on the bottom. Once all the layers are selected, you want to change the blend mode to lighten. And what the lighten blend mode does is it takes the lightest portion of each layer, and that's what it shows. So you can imagine all those layers, the beam going through the different spots of the sky, that's the brightest spot in each layer that's being shown. So all of those bright beams get shown into one image just like this, get revealed into one image. Mm-hmm. It's really that easy, and it happens instantaneously. This is it looks like a complex technique, but it's not.
Amazing.
What you can do, let me come back a little bit. I was fortunate on this night that I was shooting under moonlight, so I didn't have to worry about having a dark foreground. But if you're shooting, say, on a new moon night, you're out doing some Milky Way photos and some star trails, and you want to do this kind of shot, and you don't have any light filling the foreground, then you might want to do a separate exposure at the end, whether it's with light painting or say a 4-minute shot to allow that foreground to burn in. Or you could even set up earlier before sundown and do a blue hour shot. And then once you create this effect with the beams, then you can blend in that other foreground exposure that you did. This is a photo that Gabe did. This is the Fire Island Lighthouse just outside New York. And he wrote a great blog post on how to do this effect. So I just covered it very quickly in a couple of minutes. But if you want to see how Gabe used that technique to create this photo, then go check out the blog post at the URL right there. As I mentioned, you can create this effect in camera as well. Now, I used to do the post-processing technique exclusively. That is how I always did this. And the technique for doing this in camera actually came about as a misunderstanding between Gabe, Lance, and myself about how to do it. We were talking about doing this technique and how to maybe improve it. And Gabe had actually misunderstood it and came across, accidentally created this method for doing it, which now I actually like better. It's always great to get a photo in camera as opposed to having to spend time on the computer to make it, right? But the other benefit is doing it in camera, we can actually use a lower ISO. And let me show you how we're going to do that. So again, we're working with a revolving beam lighthouse. And remember earlier when we were covering the lens to control the exposure? Well, now we want to cover the lens to create the gap between the beams as it's moving around. So picture, say we're going to do a 20-second exposure. We open it right now. Every time we cover the lens, it creates a gap. Right? So when the lens isn't covered, it's recording the beam. And when I cover the lens, it creates a gap in the exposure. So let me show you how to pick up the camera again. Let me come back. As the lighthouse is revolving, I'm just covering the lens, right? I might be using my hand. Again, I might be using the hat. But I'm just covering the lens as that beam goes around and around. Now, this takes a little bit of practice with the timing because you've got to be consistent. You want to be covering the lens for a consistent amount of time. Otherwise, the beams look all scattered. But practice it a few times and get it down. And then you can create this really nice effect of the beams coming out, but all in one exposure. Mm-hmm. So this is a lot of fun. I love doing this now. And like I said, because what I said before, when you're shooting the beams, you've got to shoot at a second. There's been times I've had to shoot at ISO 25,000 to get a 1-second exposure of a beam going around. Here, I might be shooting a 20-second exposure, which allows me to shoot at maybe ISO 800. So not only do I have less post-processing to do, but I'm shooting at a lower ISO and getting better image quality.
Very nice. Great technique. Gabe is a genius.
Yes. I do want to make one note about composition when you're doing a beam photo, and that's that you want to leave room for the beams. It's very easy not to do this because when you're out there shooting, you have it in your head that you want to get a good composition of the lighthouse, and here's a solid composition, right? It's filling the frame. And it works fine. This composition works fine when we've got just those two beams coming out to the side. But if I were to do that technique now, I would lose most of the beams. I didn't leave room in my composition for the effect that I'm trying to create. So if you're going to do this, remember to leave what would normally be dead space. All right. So here I would want to kind of zoom out and give myself lots of space in the sky so that when I create the effect, there's room for those beams to show up in the sky there. So keep that in mind if you're trying this.
Chris, Robert Casanova is asking us if you could do this in camera using multiple exposures instead of covering the lens.
That is an excellent question. Somebody actually asked us this in a workshop, and I've been meaning to try it. You would need to do the faster exposure, so you'd be working with a higher ISO. But I can't think of any reason why it wouldn't work. So again, whoever asked that question, go try it and let me know how it turns out. I'd love to see the result.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, so there's our first problem, or our first set of problems when we're shooting lighthouses at night in particular. Now, the perspective issue is something that comes up whether we're shooting lighthouses at night or in daytime. But it's something I absolutely want to cover because it's something I'm always thinking about when shooting lighthouses. And this is a good example why. If you are not careful about perspective, you end up with a photo where the lighthouse looks tilted. Is this right? Is this wrong? That's up to you. I wouldn't call it wrong, especially if it's a deliberate artistic judgment. I would never call anybody's artistic decision wrong. In fact, some people would argue that this is absolutely fine because this is how we're used to seeing a photo. But an architectural photographer would never do this, right? Architectural photographers go through great pains to keep the lines straight, to keep our perspective correct. And my hunch is that even if you are okay with how this looks, that if you were to start trying to do it differently, then you would stop being okay with how this looks. Because you can correct this. You can shoot in a way to correct this, and you can process in a way to correct this. And we're going to talk about both. So fixing perspective. The first thing I want to talk about is lens choice. What lens you use affects how this is going to, how much perspective problems you're going to have and how you can fix it, and also doing it in post-production. And I'm going to talk about field techniques to keep this from happening, or to at least be able to control it so it's not as problematic. Lens choice. Number one is you want to be using, ideally, a lens that doesn't create too much distortion. The IRIX 11 and 15, I love these lenses. They're rectilinear lenses, which means that they're not, like a fisheye is the example where everything bends, right? It's a wide angle lens where all the lines are bending. And you can use that creatively. And I'll show an example of that later. But if you want to keep the lines straight, then you want to be using a rectilinear lens. So the better lenses are going to give you a better result when it comes to this, this particular technique. And here's an example. So I shot this with an IRIX 15 millimeter rectilinear lens, pretty much under the lighthouse. But because I'm using a lens that does a better job keeping the lines straight, I don't have a ton of distortion in this image. Now there's some perspective distortion, but not so much that I find it distracting. And that's an important thing. We can't always get the perspective perfect and have the composition that we want. So the question is the perspective distortion so bad that it's distracting, right? And here I find that it's not. Another lens you can use is a shift lens. And this is something that I've come to use a lot because it makes it a lot easier to control or just completely avoid perspective distortion in the field. And I love that idea, right? I love being able to solve the problem in the field. Now, this is a lens that most people don't carry. If you're an architectural photographer, you probably own a set of these. You own 2, 3 of these lenses because they are critical to being able to do that kind of work. Most other people don't have this. So I'm not suggesting that you go out and spend $2,000 on a lens just to shoot lighthouses, unless shooting lighthouses is really important to you. Maybe you do want to make that investment. Personally, as much as I love doing it, I don't own the $2,000 lens. This is an old Nikon shift lens. It's manual focus, and it's perfectly sharp and was a lot less expensive. I think I bought this for just a few $100s used on eBay. And this stays in my bag every time I might be shooting a lighthouse, because it does make controlling perspective distortion so much easier in the field. And here's an example. So this is with this lens that I just held up, the Nikon 28 shift lens, and everything, all the lines are nice and straight. There's a tiny bit of distortion, but not so much that it is troublesome. Here's another photo of the same lighthouse. Look at how many lines are in this. There's the lines of the windows and the lines of the corner of the building and the lines of the house in the background and the lines of the tower and the line of the flagpole. And they're all straight. Now, the flagpole's bent a little bit, but that's because of the wind. Everything is straight because I am using a shift lens that makes it so much easier to keep those lines straight. There is hardly any perspective distortion in here. Okay,
Chris,
yes.
You had to purchase one focus shift lens. What millimeters would you purchase? That's the question from Dave Gillard.
Well, there aren't a lot of options. I bought the 28 because, I didn't want to spend $2,000 on a modern one. Now, the Nikon has, I believe, a 19 millimeter, which is so tempting because wide angle is great for shooting at night. And I'm almost always shooting wide angle at night because that allows me to get more stars and the Milky Way and star trails and to do all that. So if you're willing to spend more, then I would go wider. If you're going to get one and you're shooting at night, then get a wider lens. If you want to keep it to a little more budget, like I did, and again, I just did this because the only time I use this is for shooting scenes like this. Mm-hmm. So I was willing to spend a few $100s on it, and the 28 was as wide as I could go with Nikon. But I would go wide, especially if you're going to shoot at night.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so that's how to do it with gear. Here's how to do it with post-production. And again, this isn't a post-processing class, so I'm just going to go through this quickly. And if you want to learn more about how to do it, there's a million tutorials online about it. So let's take this photo, the one I showed before that I don't like how all the lines are bending in. I can fix this in post. Now, it's tempting to do it in Lightroom, right? Because we can do so much in Lightroom that it's very tempting never to leave it. And there is the transform feature of Lightroom. But as great as Lightroom is at so many things, it's not great at this feature. So I'll use the transform panel to fix very minor corrections with perspective distortion. But this is not a minor correction. So if I tried to do it, I love to use the guided tool in the transform panel because that allows me to draw lines. So you can see those two lines next to the tower. I drew those two lines because that's what I wanted to be straight. So I'm telling Lightroom, make those lines straight and fix the perspective distortion around that. But look what happens when I do that, right? Even going with vertical, which is tempting, everything I'm doing, I've got this problem. What's this big problem? I'm losing a lot of the image. Look at those corners, right? So that's all empty now. Those big triangles in the corner is because the perspective distortion was so bad that in order to correct it, I'm losing a lot of information, no matter what I do, right? So it's a problem no matter what setting of the transform tool I use. And then I end up with a crop that looks like this. That's not what I wanted the photo to look like. The crop is terrible, and the tower still has distortion. So this is why I say that Lightroom is not the right tool for this unless it's a very minimal correction. Instead, come into Photoshop. So open that photo in Photoshop and use the perspective warp tool. Using perspective warp, you can draw a box around what you want to correct, and then you make adjustments to that box to tell Photoshop what lines you want to be straight, and then it'll make the correction for you. So you can see this isn't perfect. There is still distortion in that tower, but it's a lot better than I was able to do in Lightroom. So if you want to go to the post-processing method, I highly recommend just researching online how to use the perspective warp tool in Photoshop. But for me, I try to do it in the field. So you might be seeing this as a trend with me now. I'm certainly by no means, I'm not an anti-post-processing person. I'm not somebody who says you've got to do everything in camera. But I do like doing as much in camera as I can to minimize the work I've got to do on the computer later. When I'm home, I don't mind doing post-processing, but I'd much rather be spending time either planning my next shoot or spending time with my daughter or doing something like that. So how can I fix this in the field? And there's a few strategies that I can use to how I frame the photo to control or completely eliminate perspective distortion. And the first thing is to put the tower in or near the center of the frame. And this is why, if you put the tower all the way to one side, that's not what it's going to look like unless you've got a perspective control lens. And even then, it's not going to look this perfect. With most lenses, if you put the tower off to the side, it's going to look like that. All right. Don't believe me? There we go. This is a photo of a lighthouse in Florida. And you can see how much distortion there is just because the lighthouse is to the left of the composition with a wide angle lens. And if you still don't believe me, all I'm going to do, I'm going to show you the next photo. All I'm doing is rotating the camera on the tripod so that the lighthouse is now in the center. So that's a huge difference. And the closer to the lighthouse you are, the wider the lens you're using, the more this becomes a problem. This is just a difference of where I put the lighthouse in the frame. That to me is an unacceptable amount of distortion. And here it looks pretty good. The next thing we want to do is we want to try to keep the camera level. If we are pointing up with a wide angle lens, then it tends to look like this. So we're getting perspective distortion that makes the tower narrower at the top. And here's an example. So I think this photo's fine. I kept the tower in the center on purpose, so I didn't have it bending in. But there is a fair amount of distortion as the tower goes up toward the top of the frame. If I can keep the camera level, then it's going to minimize that. So again, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the lighthouse in or near the center. And the second thing I do is I level the tripod. So here's an example. So this is set up. This is at the West Quoddy Head Lighthouse in Maine. And I've got here, I've got a double whammy. I've got the perspective control lens on the camera, and I've made sure it's nice and level. And then I get nice straight lines in the photo. So you can see the tower doesn't have any noticeable perspective distortion, and the vertical lines of the house look good as well. Everything's nice and everything's nice. Now, one problem that you might have when you're doing this, because I've said two things to do that you normally wouldn't do, right? I've said, put that lighthouse in the center of the frame and make sure your camera's level. Now, I've just given you, I've really narrowed the boundaries of what you can do with your composition now, right? We don't usually want our subject in the center of the frame. And by making the camera level, look at this photo. I've just created a ton of dead space on the bottom. Fortunately, I'm not shooting in 1995. I'm shooting in 2022, soon to be 2023, and my camera has a lot of pixels. And everybody here with a modern digital camera has a lot of pixels. You can afford to crop and still have plenty of resolution to make a very nice print or a very nice photo to put on Instagram or whatever you're doing with your photos. So even though this photo has a ton of dead space on the bottom, I can crop and make a nice composition out of it. Here's another example. So I put the lighthouse in the center of the frame and I've got my camera level. So there's no distortion in the lighthouse, but I've got all this dead space on the right. That's okay. I just cropped it to a square. This wasn't by accident. I anticipated this in the field, right? So I shot with solid technique to avoid perspective distortion, knowing that I was going to crop this in post-production. Now, there is a cost, right? There is a cost. I'm losing pixels. I'm losing a third of my frame that I just cut out of there. If that's not acceptable to you, then that's fine. Then this technique's not for you. This happens with a lot of photography techniques, right? There's always a cost. If we want more depth of field, we've got to shoot at a slower shutter speed. If we want to capture action, then we lose depth of field because we've got to shoot at a wide aperture, or we've got to shoot at a high ISO, and we've got noise. There's so often a price to pay for fixing photography problems. Using this technique to control perspective distortion comes at a cost. You've got to cut a third of your photo out, but it solves a problem. Now, you've got to decide which is more important to you. Do you want those other pixels? If they're important to you, then maybe you want to use the post-production method instead. If you're not concerned about that, if you're happy with the resolution of your camera and you know you can cut a third of it out and still have a quality image, then I would very much encourage you to try to control the perspective distortion in the field like this. Another thing you can do is shoot a panorama. This is giving you more pixels and it's kind of opening up your field of view, right? And you can control perspective this way and get a better composition. So here we are back at the West Quaddy Headlight. I've shot here a lot the last couple of years, so a lot of examples from here. So I wanted this kind of composition. I wanted that Milky Way behind the lighthouse, but there's not a ton of room to work over there. I couldn't back up any more than I already had, and I have to use a wide angle lens and look at that crazy amount of distortion. To me, this is not a pleasing photo. This is not what I wanted my photo to look like. But if I switched my camera to vertical and shot a panorama, then I could get it what I wanted it to look like, right? So First, let me back up. One option, again, I put that lighthouse at the center of the frame and then cropped from the bottom. So that was one way to get what I wanted. But what I really wanted was that horizontal. So I shot 3 frames, and this is with the that IRIX 11 rectilinear lens that I mentioned. And it only took 3 frames to do it. Believe it or not, Photoshop was able to stitch a good panorama out of these, even though the left frame and the right frame, the lighthouse is so drastically different than it is in the middle frame. But this was enough information to get the photo that I wanted. Now, one thing I want to point out here, something that was important is, remember, I'm trying to avoid perspective distortion. So I made sure that at least one frame, there wasn't any. So that center frame, there's no perspective distortion. For that center frame, my lighthouse is in the center of the composition, and I'm dead level. Of course, I'm dead level anyway because I'm shooting a pano. But the important thing here is that I made sure that the way I set up my panels, so I knew how far I was going to have to move the camera from one shot to the next, but I knew that that center frame, the lighthouse was going to be dead center. And that way, when I stitch, I end up with no perspective distortion. So this is the final result from those 3 photos, to go from this, stitch them together, and then do a Lightroom edit. And this is the composition I wanted for getting the Milky Way behind the lighthouse. Here's another example. Lots of distortion over at the left, but in the center, that lighthouse looks good because, again, I strategized to have no perspective distortion in the panel that I shot of the lighthouse in the center. So here's another one. This is the Cape Hatteras light. This is 5 panels. And again, the exact same strategy. You see that center panel. There's no perspective distortion, but there is some in the panels on either side of it. But that center one looks good. So therefore, the final image is going to look good. Incidentally, and this is just a little bit of an aside, how did I know how far to move the camera from one panel to the next? You can eyeball it. Plenty of people shooting panos do that. But this is another Photopills feature that I use a lot is I go into the field of view pill, and here I've got my camera set, the D5, and I set my focal length as 11 millimeter, and that tells me that I've got a 94.74 degree field of view. When I'm shooting a panel, so the recommendation is that you want to overlap your panels by 1/3 to 1/2. Now, I always try to do 1/2 because I always feel that more information is better. So I come into the field of view and I see I've got 90 degree field of view for this setup. I just round that down to 90 and cut it in half, 45 degrees, right? So for each panel, I moved my camera 45 degrees, and that's how I was able to end up with, it's perfect, right? So each panel is perfectly has a consistent separation between them, and consistent overlap, just by doing that with the Photopills field of view pill.
That's interesting use.
Another thing that Photopills helped me with was the stars. Now, I was putting a lot of work into this photo, right? So I wanted to make sure I had really good star points. I'm perfectly happy using the 400 rule in a lot of circumstances, but you can use the spot stars pill. If you're doing a photo where you really care about those stars not moving, I recommend coming into spot stars. We have another blog post on our website about how to use this. But this told me that with that 11 millimeter lens, I could shoot at 14 seconds before the stars started to move. 14 seconds. Now that 11 millimeter lens is an f4. That's not a lot of light. All right. I wanted to get a nice crisp Milky Way. So this is kind of outside the parameters of the talk, but because of that, I also did noise stacking. So I used Sequator. And if you're on a Mac, then it's Starry Landscape Stacker. And I shot 8 different photos for each panel and then ran them through Sequator to get rid of the noise and then stitch them together to create the final image. So Photopills was pretty heavily involved in creating this one.
Yeah, the first thing, knowing when the Milky Way was going to be there. Right?
Yes, and I did that too. I wish I had that. I wish I took a screenshot of it, but I was there in daylight and knew exactly where I was going to be setting up the camera because I used night AR to see where the Milky Way was going to be on both sides of the scene. So I knew exactly where to set up.
It's beautiful composition.
Thank you. Thanks for the help. All right. Another thing you can do is just make the lighthouse smaller in the frame. So in this case, the camera's level, but I don't have a special lens and the lighthouse is way to the left. But the smaller something is in the frame, the less perspective distortion it will have. So there is some there. If you look closely, it's there, but it's not that bad. Same here. If you look closely at that lighthouse, there is some perspective distortion, but because the lighthouse, the tower is small in the frame, it's not really reading. It doesn't become an objectionable amount of distortion. Okay, so we've covered the two big problems, which is exposure and perspective. Now let me just give you some miscellaneous tips. Don't be afraid to light paint a lighthouse, right? So this photo, not bad on its own, but add a little bit of light, and now we've got something a little more special, right? So, as long as you're not bothering anybody else around, and by all means, get out a flashlight or your light panel and add some light to the structure itself, add some light to the scene. Also, can you shoot star trails with a lighthouse? A lot of people might think that, no, you can't. You can't shoot a 1-hour exposure with a lighthouse because of that bright light, but you can. So in this case, it was just star stacking. So this is the same, if you were going to shoot star trails in a moonlit environment or in the suburbs, someplace where you have light, someplace where you can't do a 1 or 2 or 3 hour exposure, you can shoot individual photos and stack them together to create the star trails. Incidentally, I use Photopills for this one too. I was there in daylight and knew I wanted to do this photo and used the night AR to see exactly where the North Star was going to be. So I knew exactly where that tripod had to go when I came back in the dark. So again, just shooting multiple frames. These were 2-minute exposures, if I remember correctly. And I shot a whole series of them. And then same as we did with the beam photos, just open them all as layers in Photoshop and then change the blend mode to lighten, and that creates the trails. If you want to see an example, a really extreme example of this, check out this blog post. This is a photo that one of my business partners at National Parks at Night, Lance Kymig, did. Lance created a 50-minute exposure of star trails. And remember that method we talked about? This is a flashing beam lighthouse. And this beam is flashing for 2 seconds, and then off for 2, and then on for 2, and then off for 9. So how did he do this for 50 minutes? He covered the lens. For 50 minutes, he counted to 2 and covered the lens, and then counted 9 and covered the lens, and he kept covering the lens every 2 seconds and every 9 seconds. He kept doing that.
My God.
Yeah. So check out this blog post and read about how Lance put this one together. It's a heck of a story. Be creative with lenses. Talked about a fisheye before. Do you have a fisheye? The Nikon's got the 18 to 15 millimeter fisheye zoom. I love that lens. Get that out and see what you can do with the lighthouse. If you can get in the lighthouse, I love using a fisheye inside the lighthouse. Also be creative with shutter speeds. This is a twilight photo. It looks a little daylighty, but there were clouds moving. Now, I love shooting long exposures of clouds. And if you can get the clouds coming either, if they're moving either right towards you or if they're moving directly away from you, then you can do a long exposure and get these nice streaks that go toward the center of the frame. And that's what I did here. And how did I do this? You know, it's still twilight, so I did have some light. I couldn't do just a 10-minute exposure without blowing it out. So I put a couple of filters on. I put on a 10-step neutral density, and I stacked that with a 3-step neutral density, and I used a polarizer. So altogether, that ate about 15 stops of light. I did a test exposure, and I plugged that into the exposure pills, the exposure pill and Photopills. And if you see down the equivalent settings at 15 stops, Photopills lets me put in that I use a neutral density filter for a 15-stop difference, which gave me a 10-minute exposure, 10-minute and 30-second exposure. So thank you, Raphael, once again.
Thank you, Herman, the designer.
A lot of the photos that I've showed in the presentation, the tower was the primary compositional subject. But remember that there's a landscape around it. Look for other elements in the scene. So here we've got the house on the right, and the oil house is on the left. And there's this beautiful path and the fence. There are a lot of things to work with here to create a more complex composition. Same thing here. I loved the way that the path was curving around and incorporated that. And back to this photo of, this photo is not about the lighthouse so much as it is about these old pilings that are in the water and the blur of the water. And the lighthouse is just one element of a broader composition. So keep that in mind too as a possibility. Also look for things that the light might be doing, right? So we know to do this at sunrise and sunset, right? You can shoot the sun on the horizon, or you can shoot what that sun is lighting up. And you can do the same thing with a lighthouse. This is a photo that Lance did up at the Marshall Point Lighthouse in Maine. I've shown you a few photos of that. But he pointed away from the lighthouse. He saw that the beam was lighting up the tree line on the other side of the water, and it was lighting up the rocks in the foreground. And so he created this photo. Here's one that Gabe did. He saw how the lighthouse was casting this really cool shadow of the tree. And then he put himself in the frame too, and used the shadows and the light that the lighthouse was creating to create this interesting composition, something that's deviated a little bit from what was obvious. Also, shoot in bad weather, right? We talk about this in photography in general. Bad weather makes for good photography, and that couldn't be more true than when shooting lighthouses. In fact, if you have any kind of a photojournalistic mind, a photojournalistic approach to your photos, and you're using your photos to tell a story, lighthouses were made for bad weather. So bad weather helps tell that story. This photo would not have been the same without the weather. It was raining, and I had the puddle in the foreground, and the clouds were in the back being lit up by the village that was it's about 20 miles away. I love this photo, and I wouldn't have been able to shoot this. I wouldn't have been able to create something that has this kind of a mood on a clear night. Same thing here. This was miserable shooting conditions. The rain was just coming down. But I was able to get, a little bit of a beam effect and be able to get that wet bricks in the foreground and the streaking clouds in the background. None of that would have been possible on a clear night. So while I was miserable, the misery was only temporary, right? I was miserable that night. I was wet and I was cold, but eventually I was back at the hotel and take a hot shower and put some dry clothes on. So the misery was temporary, but the photo I have. This is, if you've ever heard this term, type 2 fun. Type 2 fun is something that's miserable when you're experiencing it, but it's fun to think back on. This is definitely a type 2 fun experience. And here's another example. I had scouted this photo to be the moon coming up next to the lighthouse, and then clouds rolled in. So it would have been really easy to say, I'm not going to get the photo I wanted. Let's just pack it in and get a good night's sleep. But the moon was backlighting these clouds, right? And it just looks so cool. So again, bad weather, good photography. And incidentally, I mentioned that I had scouted this in daylight. This is the photo that I had intended to do using Photopills and the night AR to see where the moon was going to be coming up. But again, I'm reacting to the weather and reacting to the conditions that I have to create something, even if it's not the photo that I originally had in mind.
Have you come back to that place?
Oh yeah, I shoot there all the time. That particular lighthouse is it's about 6 hours from me, so it's not like I can go whenever I want, but. Yeah, I can get back there. You want me to go back and get the moon coming up next to it?
Of course.
Scouted. So that's the presentation. So just to remind you, we do have these the 2 conferences coming up, the Night Photo Summit in February and Nightscaper in May. Also remember, I should have put that slide in again, but remember my book, Photographing Lighthouses, is coming out on May 2nd. So please go to photographinglighthouses.com and put in your email address, and we will contact you as soon as that is released. So thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think we have one question left, because many people were asking about or suggesting the panorama technique to correct the distortion. And you answered that on the presentation very well, very nice. And then we have Tim Hoover that is asking, are people living in the houses associated with the lighthouses? If so, do you sneak around in the dark? do you announce your presence? What do you do?
I'm glad you asked that. So I don't go on private property without permission. A lot of lighthouses are still run in the U.S. by the Coast Guard, and they're government owned or owned by the military, and it's easy to find out if they are. You just go online and you can find that information, and then ask permission. Some places are going to be off limits, and but a lot aren't. And you can, just being nice goes a long way. Show some people some photos of what you do and what you want to do there, and I said more often than not, I get a yes. Some of the lighthouses are privately owned and people live there. The lighthouses that are still active, a lot of them have been automated, but there are still lighthouse keepers who live in some of them. So again, just ask permission. A lot of the lighthouses are also public property too, and you can go on go on the grounds at night without any problem. But I'm glad you asked that, because it is an important consideration. I don't recommend trespassing at night just to get a photo.
Awesome. We have a lot of comments saying thank you in the chat. Carmen says, "Thank you so much. I learned so much, and I can't wait to try out." Well, great presentation. We have also Robert Casanova that he was asking, do you use any equatorial mount, star tracker for your photos, including lighthouses?
It's just out of reach. I do have a move, shoot, move rotator that I don't think I've never used it for a lighthouse photo. I'll use it sometimes, because it allows me to do a 2-minute star point exposure. I suppose you could use it with the lighthouse photo, but the mount is going to move, which means that lighthouse is moving. So you've got to do that. Lighthouse is going to be moving across your frame as the mount moves. And so it's going to get blurry. So you need to do a separate exposure of just the lighthouse that you layer onto your star point exposure in Photoshop, which is fine. That's a standard technique for when you're using an equatorial mount to do astro landscape photography. The thing I had to be concerned about is if we're doing a lighthouse photo, usually the lighthouse is kind of a larger part of the composition. So that's a pretty big element of the scene that you've got to layer in, which becomes more problematic. But you certainly could try it. I'm going to put that in the same category as the other two ideas. If you try it and it works, I'd love to see it. Contact me through the website and let me know how it turns out.
Awesome. Jim Thompson is asking for the link of your new book. We're going to type it in the comments. It's photographinglighthouses.com, right?
Photographinglighthouses.com. And I can, here, I've got that. Let me just share. I've got that slide up again.
Photographinglighthouses.com.
Here you go.
Okay, let's share it here. You have, guys, go check it.
Yes.
Then the last question.
Go ahead.
Well, I have a few, but Ron is asking, where do you live? Well, that's another question. But
I live in South Carolina.
South Carolina, good. And then we have Hubert Cole. Any issues with the national parks professional rules? Yes, you ask permissions, I suppose.
I assume you're talking about whether you need a permit as a professional photographer. I don't personally have any issues with it. When we do workshops, we always get a permit to be there. If I'm shooting not on a workshop, I always work in a way that doesn't require me to have a permit. So there are certain reasons you need to get a permit if you're using models, or if you're using studio lights, props, if you've got more than 2 people working with you. These are all the things, at least in the US, these are all the things that put you up into the professional level in the eyes of that park, and they want you to have a permit to be there. Also, if you want to do a shoot in an area that's not normally accessible to the public. So I just avoid all that. It's pretty easy. I'm either shooting alone, or I don't shoot with a crew. I might be shooting with friends, but I'm not setting up big lights. So no, I don't have any issues with that. But I do encourage following the rules. If you're going to do a big complex shoot that calls for a permit, get one. They're not expensive, and it's a lot easier than being kicked out and fined.
Yes, follow the rules. That's very, very important. Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rafael.
It's been a fantastic class. People in the chat watching. Still 160 people watching.
Great.
Us live at the moment. So thank you so much for being here after 1 hour and a half of this amazing class. Thank you so much. Chris, any other words you want to say before we say goodbye?
No, thank you for having me, and thank you for Photopills. It made me a better photographer.
No, you were the photographer. We just there to give you a little push. Okay. Well, Chris, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for watching us. As always, if you like this video, give us a like, subscribe, and I'll see you next Wednesday in another video. And remember, you have the power to imagine, plan, and shoot legendary photos. Bye-bye. Chris, thank you. Hope to see you very soon. Bye, guys.